Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a deeper look at the most important or interesting aviation story of the past week with the AIN editor who covered it. I'm AIN News Editor Chad Troutvetter. This week, AIN senior editors Kerry Lynch and Charles Alcock helped to dissect why Aerion Supersonic fizzled out last week. Kerry delves into what happened, if demand still exists for a supersonic business jet, and what's next for Aerion, or more accurately, its intellectual property. Meanwhile, Charlie gives a look at the current aerospace funding environment and whether investment in eVTOLs is sucking air from longer-term projects such as Aerion. So last Friday, Aerion kind of imploded, I guess, and they were developing a supersonic business jet. And so I guess the big question on everybody's mind is there's still a market for speed in the business aviation segment.
Chad, I honestly believe that there really is. Aerion had claimed to have racked up an order book of somewhere north of $11 billion. Now, how much of that was actually backed by hard deposits, we don't know. But the bottom line is their hallmark names like FlexJet, NetJets were willing to get out in front and publicly say, we want this airplane. And customers have said they still want a supersonic jet. You know, talking to Gulfstream over the years, Gulfstream has always said that speed ranks at the top or near the top in every survey of its customer base of what they want. And Gulfstream's been kind of dabbling in supersonics for years. However, they've just never felt that the regulatory environment along with the market had coincided just yet.
Well, actually, let's talk about the regulatory market. Where are we right now with supersonic regulation?
Things are changing on the regulatory front, and in a large part thanks to Aerion. Because when Aerion first went down this road in the early 2010s, they went to regulators and they were basically told there's no market for this plane and there's no interest, and there's certainly environmental opposition. So unless you can demonstrate a need to take a visit or revisit of the regulations, we're not going to. And that's exactly what Aerion did. And obviously, not only Aerion, but many other players have jumped into it, generating enough interest that all of a sudden Congress started taking a look at it, and they went to and they passed legislation calling on the FAA to look at it, and the international regulators have come on board and are looking at it too. So, there's promise of change in looking at it. I don't think they'll ever let the Concorde fly again or anything like the Concorde, but they're willing to look at concepts that demonstrate quieter aircraft. So if the supersonic market can demonstrate that it is more environmentally friendly, then it has a greater chance of change. And ICAO is expected to revisit its regulations and maybe look at suggestions based on new noise data that's supposed to be conducted in the next few years, but towards the end of this decade anyways.
Well, and NASA's doing low boom tests over the Southwest U.S., right?
Yes, they're going to start doing that. I think the latest timeline was later this year, early next year. But the key thing is they're going to be conducting trials, not just the Southwest, but throughout the U.S. in various population centers and types of populations to see what the impact is on the population, what the willingness of the population to accept something like a soft thud or a low boom, just a quieter supersonic aircraft. And that noise data is supposed to serve as a basis for the next regulations that FAA and perhaps ICAO look at.
Yeah, that could pave the way for supersonic overland flight, right?
Yes, it could. And that's a great point, that you can fly supersonic over the ocean in many parts, but you cannot do it over most land. And that's really key because, while it's nice to have it over the ocean, it really hamstrings the usability of a supersonic aircraft. So, but that's one of the interesting things about Aerion is they were willing to design their aircraft around existing regulations, which made it a very practical and possible option of reaching market earlier.
So if they were able to design something that could operate in the current regulation environment as well as the future, over land, if that happened, they kind of hit the environmental side. They were saying that our engine will be able to run on 100% sustainable aviation fuel, and so they were doing all the right things. So what happened? Why did the company kind of come to a quiet end? I guess like it almost ends with a whimper almost.
Well, it's the almighty dollar at the end. When they started this, Chad, they knew from the get-go, back in early 2000s, 2003, when it launched, that this would be a $5 billion program. Now, they had a very strong investor who has stuck with them through the very beginning, Robert Bass. But I'm told that when they went down this road, he said, "This is my limit." And I don't know what that limit is, but he gave a hard number of what he was willing to invest in this program. And that was a challenge to say, you need to have other investors because this is an expensive prospect. So Bass really, there are people who really give him a lot of credit for sticking with this company through 18 years and pouring the money he did in, but they're only so far one person can do. So Aerion did the next best thing and they went to look for other partners. And their first option was Airbus. And Chad, we had discussed this before, but Airbus obviously is interested in other things. It's interested in hydrogen and sustainability, and now just getting back its footing after the pandemic. But at the time, Airbus was very interested in the technology that Aerion had, but I'm told not so much in actually building a business jet. So that partnership was going to forward the technology, but it may not have gotten the AS2 to the market. So that kind of faltered. And then Aerion found a happy home with Lockheed Martin. But like Airbus, Lockheed Martin, which is a big defense company, had different priorities. And in fact, Lockheed Martin now is working with NASA on this soft thud, baby boom, whatever you want to call it, research. But it wasn't the right fit once more for Aerion. So it really was Boeing who came along. It's like the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Boeing was the right fit. The problem was it was the wrong time. So I went back and looked at this. Boeing and Aerion formed their partnership 1 month before the second MAX crashed. And of course, the MAX was supposed to be a cornerstone program for Boeing. It was, the next great thing. They had all these orders and they were going to make a lot of money. And then all of a sudden, that whole program came to a grinding halt and they couldn't build them. They lost orders. And then on top of that, the pandemic set in. So Boeing just had no money. As a matter of fact, it had its worst year ever last year. I think it lost upwards of $12 billion. So while Boeing has the desire, and after Aerion made its announcement that it was ending the program, Boeing still expressed an interest in supersonic or such type of technologies. It just doesn't have money, so there's no way Boeing could get Aerion over the finish line. That left Aerion to find an investor. And while the market may have been there, investors who did surveys believed it was there. Companies such as FlexJet and NetJet said, we're on board. the investor community, I was talking to a veteran marketer who said the investor community is fickle. And right now they're very, very interested in things like sustainability and the next great things like eVTOL. So, Aerion, interestingly, over the past year had announced an affinity for eVTOL and wanted partnerships in that arena so they could build this whole transportation ecosystem. And now I'm wondering if that wasn't a way to try and leverage some of that investment interest in the eVTOL sector.
Well, that makes sense because I always wondered why they were getting into they kind of got into the door-to-door service, which and they saw that the eVTOL is the gap between the door and the airport. So that kind of makes sense that they were trying to ride the coattails of that to get some investment. I understand there was also a Spac that they were trying to get funding from called Altitude Acquisition. Did you hear anything about that?
Yes. I don't know what happened there, but earlier this year, they had indicated that that was a real possibility. And of course, we all know SPACs have become the white hot way of going public. Because they've become so white hot, the SEC has started sniffing around and give notice that it's going to be looking at how these are conducted. And I was reading this article, I believe it was in Forbes, about how they changed the approach of warrants. And I have to say right up front, if we get too deep into this, I'm going to get myself into trouble very quickly. But it was a procedure change or view that made SPACs a little bit more difficult. So I don't know if that played into the inability to pull that off, or if there were other things that undid that. But the bottom line is the SPAC did not come through. Yeah, I was talking to somebody who was very close to the company who said that Aerion was, quote, agonizingly close to getting that investment that would have given the push into production, but it fell apart or was not to be.
Right. Well, and they also had several partners, GE, Honeywell. Was there any money from those, or was it just a risk sharing partnership?
I believe it was more risk sharing partnership, and it may not have even been as much as some of the other programs. GE. First of all, when I was talking to this veteran marketer, he noted that the fact that Aerion was able to come on board with such tight relationships with the likes of GE was a huge endorsement of the Aerion program. It was really a major milestone that this was going forward. But companies like GE also were suffering from the pandemic. They're having their own problems. And they had discussed GE was going to build the engine for the Aerion, and the affinity was supposed to be the beginning of a family. So GE had larger sights set on the supersonic realm beyond just Aerion. But without your anchor platform, you're not going to go forward. So they discontinued production of the affinity, or not even production. They discontinued the development work on it the minute Aerion made its decision. And there's only so much help you could get from companies like GE during a pandemic when they're laying off, maybe 13,000 plus workers. And that's what they had done over the past year.
Yeah, and Aerion also had a claim backlog of I think it was 11.2 billion. Was that escrowed? And was there any way to leverage that to get funding? Did they try that? What does the backlog mean, I guess, as far as investment?
Well, as far as funding the company, typically funds in escrow cannot be used for you cannot take that cash and put it into the company, obviously. But what it can do is demonstrate that there is a real market for this, and that and that would be attractive to investors. But it is so high risk, Chad. And if investors have different priorities, such as the eVTOL segment, unless they're really hard deposits, and we don't know that. I mean, Aerion's backlog in a little over a year went from 3 billion to 11 billion. Well, NetJets made an order for 20 aircraft, but they were just options. So we don't know how they were counting the backlog, and that may have played into it. If they were desperately looking for money, they're going to throw everything but the kitchen sink into the backlog, I would imagine. Now, again, they may have all been firm orders backed by deposits. We're not completely clear on that, but the important thing is the best part about it is it would have demonstrated that if you invest in us, we do have a customer base for this airplane. Yes, it is a risk. Yes, the regulations aren't quite there yet, but they're coming. But we have all these people who have said they want supersonic.
So I guess the big question is now, what happens? Is Aerion still salvageable? If a white knight investor comes in and funds them, can they just pick up where they left off? Or, is this really the end and it's up to Boom and perhaps Spac to carry the ball going forward?
Well, that's the $6 million question, Chad.
Well, actually, $6 billion, right?
Yes. Yeah. $6 billion question. Very good. There could always be a white knight investor. I mean, the company is still a going entity. They haven't yet said bankruptcy yet. And I'm sure there is a level of obligations that the company may have. So there could be a white knight. There could be somebody who comes over in and buys the IP because they've developed a substantial amount of IP. And they have some patents and technologies that they weren't even using in this design that may have come down the road, especially in the field of laminar flow. They were way out in front with some of their research. But Aerion is operating as if it is shutting down. And, a lot of the employees in the company have a high level of employees have stated or indicated their availability for other opportunities. I'm told that Tom Weiss has personally been on the phone trying to find positions for his employees. So this is not an easy time. At first, when they made the announcement, it came as such a shock that there was a wonder, well, was this just a plea to see if there would be a white knight to come in? But in fact, they are taking the steps they have fully halted operations, and the people involved, which is their primary asset, are looking for other jobs. So that suggests to me that they are operating under the assumption that it's done.
Is there any timeline for, so they're trying to sell it as a going entity right now? Is there any indication when it might actually have to file for bankruptcy? What's the funding level now that they can kind of keep limping along for a little bit?
Well, but they're not going. And like I said, their primary asset was their people, and their people are looking for other jobs. So what happens to the intellectual property and whether they can pay off their debts? I mean, they do have, Robert Bass, who's been their anchor investor, does have deep pockets. So he may be able to meet those obligations. I don't know. But they have not stated, and I've actually talked to people within the company who weren't even sure.
What do the analysts think? The
analysts think that this may not be the final chapter. However, they're concerned that this may be, Richard Abalafi of Teal Group said this may be a category killer, because in his mind, the business jets were really the only viable supersonic option. He does not see that a commercial market could exist for supersonic. It'd be just too expensive for passengers. And right now, supersonic is really on the back shelf of airlines. Everything is sustainability and electric and hydrogen. And so the priorities in the commercial realm are really much different. as far as Aerion goes, they had tremendous respect for that company. Aerion was expected to be the best option to get to supersonic, and they were taking such a practical approach to it. I mean, they brought in people who understood the aerospace market. They were looking at a viable product that would work even if the regulations didn't change. And they priced their aircraft at a rational price rather than trying to pretend they were going to fire sale them and build thousands of them. They understood that while there is a market, it's not a huge market. So Aerion definitely, a lot of analysts thought that Aerion, if supersonic was to be, that it would be Aerion. But without Aerion, there's a lot of question marks in that space. And it could be somebody like a Gulfstream, which has been dabbling in it for years and years and years, would have to step into that space. But going back to the financial standpoint, Chad, there's an old adage, and I'm going to repeat it again for the 1,000th time, that the best way to make a small fortune in aviation is to invest a big fortune. And it just to show how hard it is, all people have to do is look at Bombardier, which was almost sunk and is still struggling from building the C series. And this is a company that had the built-in supplier base, it had the built-in support network, it had the production facilities, it had the engineers on staff, it had everything you need to build a clean sheet aircraft, but it almost did it in. So, Aerion was facing a huge mountain to climb from the get-go.
All right. Thanks, Kerry. So, Charlie, you've been following the eVTOL industry for a while, and they've been getting a lot of funding. And so you're kind of close to a lot of the investors that are looking at this. So, is the eVTOL segment perhaps sucking some of the air out of investment for things that are a little more difficult, like a supersonic airplane, or anything else that might be on a much longer timeline than the eVTOL, which is kind of on a 3 to 5 year timeline?
Yeah, well, that's a very valid question, Chad. At face value, I can understand why people might jump to that conclusion, but I don't think we can say for certain that that's what's happening. What we do know is this, that large amounts of money are indeed going into new eVTOL aircraft programs. But to be clear, that money is only going into a small handful of them. There are only about half a dozen or so of these companies that are really attracting the big bucks, and they're getting a lot of attention. And so it kind of gives the impression that, oh my gosh, there's just money flowing in there like there's no tomorrow and anybody can get their hands on it. That's not really true. Now, when we look at the supersonic sector and Aerion in particular, it seems that in the first instance, Aerion was actually going after a different group of investors, not the so-called special purpose acquisition companies. They were trying to get money from strategic investors in the aerospace sector, big companies like Boeing and others. And just to be clear, the eVTOL sector largely hasn't been getting investment from that part of the industry. So those are sort of two slightly different worlds in terms of where the investments come from. Now, you mentioned the timeline for the investment. It is true that the people who are getting behind the eVTOL sector, which is the special purpose acquisition companies, but also venture capital groups, are being told that the return on investment is going to come very quickly because these aircraft supposedly are going to be in commercial service no later than about 2024. For me, that's a big, big if. And I think we could see a situation where if that doesn't happen, and there's good reason to believe it might take longer than that, you could see investors getting disenchanted and saying, hold on a minute, you told us we were going to start reaping our rewards by then. So yes, programs like Supersonic at face value are longer term and you'd have to be more patient. But, I wonder if that difference is going to be found out fairly soon.
What's the funding environment like? Is there a lot of aerospace funding out there?
Well, generally speaking, of course, a lot of the the wider aerospace sector, the people building commercial airliners and other civil aircraft products, they're having it really tough. And the main reason they're having it tough is because of COVID. They took a huge hit last year in terms of declining orders and declining revenue from the aftermarket because airlines weren't flying as much. And that hit is continuing into this year. There are signs that it is starting to get better, thankfully. And so, yes, actually, to some extent, access to investment in new research and development technology has dried up, not completely, but it has dried up to some extent. So, for example, we've seen Boeing close its Boeing Next Technology Incubator Division, although it's still backing some individual companies like Whisk, for example, which is an eVTOL company. But by the same token, we've seen its rival Airbus continuing to invest in new technology, quite impressively, given the financial troubles that they're facing. But what they're doing is they're, for the most part, investing in-house. They're investing in themselves and their ability to develop things like hydrogen aviation. They're not investing in other startups, and they're not investing in projects such as supersonic transport.
Well, and that actually brings up a good point. Is are they looking to invest more in the sustainability side versus let's go faster?
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good point again, Chad. Yes, certainly for Airbus and actually for many other companies too. But I'm thinking particularly of engine companies like Rolls-Royce and GE, CFM, Pratt & Whitney. They know that, making aviation more sustainable is no longer optional. It's an absolute imperative. And yes, they're investing in a big way in both short and medium-term measures, like making existing engines more efficient and making, the aircraft burn less fuel, essentially, in the short term, but also longer-term technology like hydrogen, which could completely replace what's there to now. They are investing very strongly in that. And you're right. In a way, the proposition of supersonic air transportation is a bit hard to sell in that context, because even though Aerion was saying, we're going to use sustainable aviation fuel, that's still not seen as really a long-term bet for making aviation greener. And at the end of the day, I think some investors may have been looking at this and saying, you know what, of course it's exciting and impressive that you could suddenly, go across the world much faster than you can today. But in the great scheme of things, does that really matter so much?
Well, I mean, in the business aviation sector, it's always been about saving time. So perhaps in this market, and the commercial market, maybe the sustainability, the zero emissions goals are more pressing than getting people there faster.
I think it might be. And even in the business aviation sector, and this is my personal opinion, I should stress, the fact is, in existing business jets, you can already save a lot of time compared with traveling on airlines. You can already use smaller airports where there aren't crowds of people. You can already fly directly to other airports closer to where you actually need to end up, and you save a significant amount of time that way. Okay, fine. These existing business jets can't fly anything like as fast as the new supersonic jets have been promised. We've been promised that they would fly. But maybe, and particularly in the post-COVID era, maybe people are more concerned about getting there safely and securely and in privacy, and getting directly where they want to be, than getting there super fast. Maybe people's priorities have shifted and they're not necessarily going to pay a premium to get there that much quicker.
Thanks, Charlie. That's very insightful and helpful. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.